and I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and many of you will have read James Moron's classic book, which I had read a chapter of previously and then was really provoked the last few months to read in full. The democratic wish, as Moron describes it, is the people taking charge of their own communities in the face of a distant and usurpative state. Now, you might think that Moron's book is really, it's about the United States. What does it have to do with Canada? But I actually think that we, as Seymour Martin Lipset said, mainly preaching to Americans, but that the best way to learn something about your own country is to look at another country that isn't your country but is similar. And he was always a major advocate for what Americans can learn from studying Canada. And I find myself sometimes not quite excommunicated. I'll flash some sort of credentials to prevent that from happening. But to actually hint that, that actually we are North Americans, and particularly for English-speaking Canadians, we are really a lot like Americans. And I know many people in this room have dual nationalities, including my wife. And that when a Canadian is in Seattle or Minneapolis or sometimes the Bay Area or Boston, it just doesn't feel that different. The people you're talking to don't seem to have that different values. On the other hand, when we go down to Louisiana and Texas, it is pretty obvious there's some major fundamental differences, but there are a number of similarities. And when I was reading through Dennis Granding's biography of Justice Hall, towards the end, when he's talking about the people who were settling Saskatchewan and what was happening in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, of course, it's massively influenced by the progressive movement that's going on just south of the border in the Dakotas and Minnesota and other places. And much of, I would say, the optimism for the future, the view of limitless potential, those kinds of things that do, I think, come from Emmett Hall, are very much affected by the environment in which he was growing in. So particularly Western Canada, I think, has got a lot of this notion of the democratic wish that we see the state that should be distant, but often the reality that the state was distant. And what are you going to do when the telegraph lines are down? And there's just your hospital between you and some sort of disaster. So I think that actually there's a lot of this stuff that's not dissimilar. And when I look at what Moron was talking about in terms of the way that in the United States the policymakers would continually throw the issues back to the community, mainly because the state did not feel it had the legitimacy itself to deal with these issues, it really resonated with me about healthcare. And in particular, looking at healthcare in the 90s, and of course I'm sitting right beside somebody, Greg, who was right there in Saskatchewan 20 years ago when the regionalization was being developed. The sort of second stage of regionalization, if we consider what Quebec started in the 70s, is the first. But the modern wave of regionalization starts in 92 in Saskatchewan. And it seems very similar to me that what were governments trying to do? Well, they didn't feel they had the legitimacy to actually change the way doctors were doing their work. So they threw the issue out to the community and looked to direct citizen participation in politics with the assumption that people will agree with each other when they have the same facts. And one of the things I've heard from, in fact, Bob Evans over the years is that data unite, right? So that we're going to agree once we get all the facts, and that people dwell in communities that they wish to preserve. So the four stages of the call to the people that Moron talks about, so it begins and ends with a policy stalemate. The call to the people provokes a popular response. There's the implementation of new institutions like regions, and then there's a return to equilibrium. Now, Moroni says that because this call is ambiguous, it rallies the oppressed classes, but it also, and it rallies the public sector, particularly those within the public sector who are seeking to increase their power and to rationalize programs, but it also rallies private elites and opposition to reform. But at the end of the day, as Moron has said, you end up with a new equation. Now, I'll mention Konstantiopoulos and Bruzel later on in their paper from 2010, which is very, very pessimistic on what Quebec has achieved through its different commissions, et cetera. But I really do think that as Moron said, that even though these new institutions are often taken over in many ways by the dominant groups in society, that they are changed just like the institutions are changed, and that in fact there is some progress over time. So I don't think that's really the full story either about what Medicare is like in Canada and where we need to go next with our health policy. But I think that Moron's work actually is quite interesting, and I would suggest people might read it again. 20 plus years old, but really I think that there's an interesting reflection on Canada now. So we need to better understand the policy world. So I'm going to give you an example here. Greg encouraged me, so I'm not blaming him, I'm actually crediting him. I had a nice chat with him yesterday. My attitude towards something like this is that you spend about 4 weeks in preparation, and then you just put everything in your head and then you write it at the last minute. So yesterday morning he suggested, be personal, talk about something about yourself, and don't be modest. Well, okay, I'll be a little immodest today. So I'm going to talk to you about something that just happened the last few months. A group that I and some others, doctors in Toronto, helped to create called Doctors for Fair Taxation. Inspired by, amongst other things, this is a wonderful quote from Justice Hall: "Freedom begins with breakfast." Justice Hall was a strong supporter of the original Canadian Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but he always believed that we need positive rights as well as negative rights. And this is a beautiful quote. As Grunding says, he borrowed the saying, but he said it more than almost anyone else. We know, health and social problems are worse in more unequal countries. Wonderful slides from Richard Wilkinson's website here. And health and social problems are not related to average income in rich countries. That income inequality is getting greater. This is from a paper that Bob Evans had this year, I think. This looks at growing income inequality. It shows the proportion of income taken by the top 1% in various countries, and there's Canada on the third from the left. We were sort of somewhat middle of the road in terms of that measure of income inequality, of pre-tax income, and we've gotten much worse very quickly. The post-tax stuff is still not as bad, but it's getting worse. And looking at government tax and non-tax receipts, just notwithstanding the mainstream press that taxes are higher all the time and we're overtaxed in Canada, we're overtaxed in Quebec, et cetera, that in fact government tax and non-tax receipts as a percent of GDP, the red line being the Canadian data, has fallen substantially. And in fact, between 2000 and 2010, non-tax receipts and tax and non-tax receipts in Canada fell by 6% of GDP. And we always, of course, break our arms patting ourselves on the back about how generous we are compared to our American cousins, but that's not true anymore. Just look at this. This measures government outlays, which are government budgets plus any deficit minus any surplus. This is what governments really spend. And when we look back 20 years ago, the Canadian state, by this definition, was roughly 35% bigger than the American state. Now it's pretty much the same size. And if Obama gets reelected in the fall, and it appears I'm not going to say anything more about this, but it appears that we are going to have a pretty conservative government for another 2.5 to 3 years in this country at least. I think that we're finally going to see U.S. Government outlays be higher than Canadian government outlays, and this will be the first time this has happened since ever. It's never happened before. The Canadian state has never been smaller than the American state by this definition ever. So and of course this 6% or so cut in GDP for government revenues during the first decade of this new century has cost governments almost $100 billion in lost revenue. Now, I know you're going to say, what can you do with $1 billion? Can't get much for $1 billion these days, but with $94 billion, we could have no government deficits, first dollar universal pharmacare, long-term care and home care, and regulated childcare for, like in Quebec, for all parents in Canada who want it. Abolish university and college tuition. That's one I'd really like to do. It's only about $8 billion. I mean, it's not a lot of money when you put it in this context. I'm worried about all those people sleeping on subway grates in downtown Toronto, or especially in a place like Winnipeg. And so we could build 15,000 units of affordable housing every year. And for those of you who are hawks in the audience, we could even buy those new fighter jets. And you're probably saying, but the price keeps on. This is 4 times, based on an estimate, 4 times the current latest maximum estimate. So it's probably okay. So Doctors for Fair Taxation, our goals were that, first of all, this started from 6 years of conversations with Philip Berger and myself. Many of you will know Philip as the Chief of Family Medicine, St. Michael's Hospital, and a long-time advocate for social justice. And for years, we've been saying, taxes are going down, we're paying less taxes, there's more economic inequality. We should form a group of doctors who want fair taxes. We decided this year was the year we had to do it, and these were our goals. Change the conversation about tax fairness, convince the Ontario government to increase personal income taxes on high earners, and convince the Ontario Government Finance Committee to review other fair revenue options for the Ontario budget in next year's budget. Our strategy was to generate political buzz because of the compelling man bites dog aspect of our story, high earners asking for higher taxes, and then to convince the Ontario NDP to ask the government to increase personal income taxes on high earners as part of their support for the budget. And this, again, this was all based, it's a minority government, and Tim Hudak is so peaked that he lost the last election, announced with, a month before the budget that his party would vote against it, which gave all the leverage to the NDP. And then we wanted to convince the Ontario government to review other fair revenue options for next year's budget. And this was our overall argument, that we're becoming more unequal. This means more health inequalities and lower overall health status. Taxes have been cut a lot. As physicians, we see the adverse impact of inequality. And then the big point, if you really feel you've got a problem, if you're telling me that things are so bad that we cannot afford to increase allowances for social assistance, even though they've fallen by between 30 and 60% against inflation since 1995, if you're saying that you have no money to build any housing, if you're saying it's really that bad, then Mr. McGuinty, surely it must be bad enough to raise the taxes of the highest earners in this country. And if it's not that time, then it's not time to cut back on the poor and the vulnerable. So we went out, and our full plan you can see at the website, but we wanted 4 new tax brackets, starting at the top 10% of earners, which starts at approximately $100,000 taxable income. We had significant assistance from Hugh McKenzie, an economist, and we also had some pro bono communications advice from Trish Hennessy at CCPA, and we then got some really cut-rate communications consultation for a month from a fellow named Chris Holcraft, who volunteered his services to us. So March 20th, we sent out a communication to approximately 500 to 800 physicians through all sorts of networks. And on March 22nd, we had a press conference. We already had 40 physicians who had signed our petition for higher taxes. And we had massive coverage, and the issue really took off. And if people at the back can cue up the video now, I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes of video from Dr. Tania Ackerson, who's a trauma surgeon at St. Michael's Hospital. Here she is actually at a demonstration a couple of weeks ago about the cuts to refugee health care. And she was front and center for many reasons in our group, because amongst other things, she earned over $400,000 last year. So she was the highest earner amongst our little group of people. And the day we went public, we had at least 30 media interviews, and we were asked to go on the Lang O'Leary Exchange. If you may know the CBC Lang O'Leary Exchange. So I'd like to just show you a couple of minutes of Dr. Ackerson and Mr. O'Leary. So if you can run that video, please.
A group of doctors has a prescription for government: raise income taxes on the wealthiest Canadians. The doctors say higher taxes are a small price to pay for a fairer country, and they've launched a campaign to get support for the idea. Dr. Tania Ackerson is a member of Doctors for Fair Taxation. Thank you for coming into the studio today.
Thank you very much, Danielle.
You don't often hear people volunteering to pay more tax, I think, especially in Canada. So what led to this?
Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting question, an important question. Well, as we know, not just in Canada or Ontario, but around the world, really, we're seeing a lot of economic austerity measures that are being implemented, but we're seeing a lot of what's happening in terms of the rich and the poor, in terms of lower income earners and how they're suffering as a result of cutbacks in social programs. I see this all the time as a trauma surgeon, where we see the impacts where the public programs might be cut back, after-school programs, breakfast programs, or whatnot. That has a direct impact on the patients that come in, that we see, that come from poor neighborhoods, that come in shot. So certainly, given this climate, a lot of physicians came together and we asked ourselves, really, what's important for our patients? What's important for Canadians? We know increasing inequality in Canada leads to actually worse health outcomes, not just for poor people, but also for rich people, for all Canadians. So what kind of society do we want to live in? And so what are some of the solutions we can come up with this?
Doctor, I'm very concerned that maybe you've been affected by some kind of trauma. Why in the world would you ever want to increase taxes? This is a very, very bad idea, and I can't believe you're even bringing it forward. Thank goodness, I'm going to give you a free pass to Kevin O'Leary's Capitalist Boot Camp this summer. I'm going to fix this problem for you.
I have a free pass
I'm going to make you come out. Look, this makes no sense. Taxing the rich has never worked. I mean, if you want to fix health care, let's get private health care in Canada so you can charge me more for services when I want them faster. I'll write you a check for that. What about that idea?
Well, Kevin, listen, thank you so much for having me on your show, and it's very nice to meet you. So to answer your question, it's interesting because what we're proposing in terms of a progressive taxation for high-income earners is nothing new for Canada. In fact, what we're saying is we should go back to doing what we were doing in the 60s. So if you look at the marginal taxation rate of high-income earners in the 60s, that was around 80%. And again, I'm a trauma surgeon. I'm not an economist. I'm not going to go through all the numbers with you.
Doctor, I'm having a heart attack. Help me, help me. 80%? Yeah. Are you out of your mind?
A marginal
80%?
Taxation rate. So just that's very important for Canadians to know. So this was the time of highest economic boom and activity in Canada. These were the golden days of capitalism. The economy was stellar, it was wonderful, and yes, the marginal rate just on the highest income was 80%. Now it's 46%, but even to talk further and deeper to that, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives actually looked at their data in 2009. We're finding that the working poor and the low-income earners are actually being taxed at a rate higher than the top 1% in Canada. Our message really is very simple. We think fair taxation is what's needed for the high-income earners because, to be honest, if that's going to keep young kids from coming into my trauma bay after being shot in the city of Toronto, then I'm happy to pay it. Canada's worth it, and Canadians are worth it.
I think
okay,
a lot
can you stop? Can you stop it now? Thanks. Thank you. So that interesting exchange, eh? And all that interesting information coming out that Kevin O'Leary is drawing out of her. Isn't that neat? So if you haven't seen that video before, play it for your friends. It's lots of fun. Okay. So quickly looking at our campaign, 3 days after we're launched, Lawyers for Fair Taxation gets launched, and we've got 80 physicians who've signed our petition. March 27th, we started a letter writing campaign to the government ministers, key government ministers, and a full court press on the NDP, because it's obvious that's who we have to get to. The NDP has not been talking about raising personal income taxes for like 20 or 30 years, but we've got to get to them. March 28th, we make the Huffington Post in the US. April 2nd, we have an op-ed in the Toronto Star. We've got 150 doctors have signed our petition now. April 3rd, I did an interview on CBC Metro Morning. April 4th, finally, Andrea Horwath, the NDP leader in Ontario, demands an extra 3% tax on incomes above $500,000 in return for NDP support for the budget. There's a lot of other things that happen over the next couple of weeks. But on April 18th, we meet with the Premier's policy advisor. It's a fun meeting. As he gets serious, I keep on saying, you just need to remember, Kareem, that everybody else is lobbying you for money. I'm lobbying you so you'll have more money. So this is the most fun I've had in years. April 19th, the Ontario budget, so the Toronto Star comes out with the headline, Andrew Horwath's Tax the Rich scheme, hugely popular. And Lauren Bosanoff from the Forum Institute says, he's just never seen this before. It's like right across all groups, 80-20. People with incomes over $100,000 a year, 77 in favor, 20 opposed. People who voted conservative in the last provincial election, 63% in favor, 33% opposed. So, you know, even a reluctant premier can read the tea leaves. So the pressure mounts. It's a fact, it turns out it's only the premier that's holding this back. The rest of his front bench is saying, are you crazy? We look stupid if we don't do this. We look mean if we don't do this. And we'll get more money. Well, the deficit will be smaller. So on April 23rd, a reluctant premier agrees to raise taxes. So how do you get an item on a policy agenda? This was just ideal. We just knew this was the time. The problem directly affects the majority of the population, so we got austerity for everybody, right, in the province. The problem is simple to understand. No problem is completely simple, but we made it simple, and we focused on personal income taxes, even though a lot of doctors are incorporated. We need to look at corporate taxes. Canada is the only country that does not have an estate tax. Even if we had the mild one they have in the US, we'd raise about $3.5 billion extra a year. So we were strategically simple. And we knew, of course, that leading up to a budget with a minority legislature, that this was going to make hot media, and we have to watch out for those policy windows. So this is, now, you need a roadmap. Everybody's got their own little map. This is my map for understanding the world. It's based on something that was originally drawn up by Paul Sabatier, and then something that was refined over the years as I taught for 10 years at McMaster with Jonathan Lomas. But it's a way of looking at the world, and we, in our diagnostic, we saw going right to the formal decision-making process that it was a minority legislature. The Conservatives had said they were going to vote against the budget, and all we had to do was get the NDP on side. It wasn't that easy, but that made it our plan. So how do you inject more evidence into policy in general? And isn't that interesting? Look at all the evidence on health inequalities and all those other things that came out just from that 3-minute interview with Tania. So that all of a sudden, huge appetite for talking about the kinds of issues around economic inequalities and health inequalities that normally, of course, would be quite boring to the media and be very difficult to get on the media. And this was a situation where I think that we were able to encourage policy-oriented learning, as Paul Sabatier describes it, relatively enduring alterations of thought or behavior that result from experience or new information and are concerned with the attainment or revision of policy objectives. So people who were opposed to what we were saying tried to argue against us, but it was just no win. So they had to revise what they were saying. Eventually the premier said, this is all I'm doing. I'm not raising taxes anymore, and all the money has to go to the deficit. We're not going to spend money on new programs, although he did admit to raising social assistance and putting money into a couple of other things. There are some preconditions to make this happen. You have to have 2 coalitions with conflicting positions. There has to be a forum available for debate. The forum has to be could be one meeting, or it could run over the media like this forum did around fair taxes. And learning is amplified if you do have a formal forum that's run according to professional norms. How might this work in healthcare? Well, most of our healthcare problems are due to antiquated processes of care. We know that, at least on paper, we could have access to needed elective specialty care within 7 days. If we implemented Nick Cates's plan for mental health in Hamilton for all specialty care across the country, we could easily do that. If we implemented advanced access, interprofessional teams, and other reforms, it'd be simple to have same-day access to regular family doctor or someone on your doctor's team, not a walk-in clinic, not somebody in another building. We could get elective surgery in 2 months and better access to the system in other ways, and we need to think really outside the box, and non-professional community health workers are a wonderful addition to improving access. How about policy forums focused on improving access? Are there some opportunities to set up forums where we can ensure the right people are in the room, and that has to include the representatives of provider organizations that tend to rag the puck, tend to hold things back. You have to have them in the room. You have to have the right process, and you have to have the right follow-up. And you need to make sure you're having the right question. And as Konstantiopoulos and Bruxelles comment towards the end of their paper, don't ask what to do. We have a pretty, we need advanced access, integration of specialists with primary health care. Yes, the details need to be molded, but that's the plan. And so we're not asking what to do, we're asking how to get there, and that becomes the question. So that when somebody says, but wait a second, I don't get paid to work that way, well, that's a legitimate issue. It has to be answered. You can't lose incomes just so everything else can be better. But hey, you're making a pile of money as it is. We'll just make sure you don't lose any money if you work in different ways. But then if somebody says, but I don't want to work this way because my vision of being a good specialist is that patients and family doctors crawl over 3 miles of broken glass begging for me to give them my received wisdom. Well, if you say that in this kind of a forum, you've lost the debate, right? So that legitimate issues are dealt with. Anything that's not legitimate, you lose face, lose credibility, and then you have to come back with something else. Now, and I think that I'm not, I've done a lot of work on this, and I'm hoping to launch something that's fairly significant in a province looking at these policy forum ideas. I can't guarantee that this is the right way to go, but I can say that I think that this is based upon good theory, and that quite frankly, I feel that we need to get creative and start trying to do these things, and then do a PDSA cycle. Do quality improvement on your exercises that are designed to draw evidence into practice. And otherwise, the alternative, as I told Anna Maria Tremonti about a year ago, is that for me, every day is Groundhog Day. I wake up in the morning, it's the same stupid healthcare policy debate. So what does this mean for you folks? I think you need to be really engaged with groups and coalitions to amplify your messages. You need to promote real policy forums, which include true debate and dialogue. Make people really answer tough questions. Ensure that they've got skin in the game. And make sure that it's not just the same characters. We have to bring in people from the business community, from social services, from education. We need to bring in people from those other communities because they're the ones that are going to make sure that we stay honest. And remember that Justice Hall wasn't afraid to voice his opinions. In fact, nowadays, I think a Supreme Court justice would be censored, perhaps, for some of the things that he went out and said because he wasn't afraid to voice his opinions. And if he wasn't, then you folks shouldn't be either. So is evidence-based health policy a utopian dream, an oxymoron, or a democratic wish? I really think it's a wish for democracy. That's what I think it's all about. And we need to remember that most Canadian doctors and most Canadian governments never wanted Medicare. If it weren't for a whole series of fortunate events, starting in Saskatchewan with Tommy Douglas, and even before Douglas came to power, what Saskatchewan had done before 44. If we hadn't had John Diefenbaker, if we hadn't had Justice Emmett Hall, oh my God, all these people are from Saskatchewan, Greg. And although I should mention, Justice Emmett Hall, of course, was born in Montreal, and so it's very appropriate that we're here today. But if we were waiting for the kind of democracy we have in Canada, which is for some, all the elite groups to say it's okay, we would have never had Medicare. That Medicare is one of the best expressions of Canadian democracy because the people wanted it, is in the benefit of the people, and we had to fight some very strong vested interests to get what we wanted. So Medicare belongs to all Canadians. It's an expression of our democracy. And as John Dewey would say, if the problem is too little democracy, then we need more of it. And that's why we need, I think, to broaden our debates on health policy. So in summary, the views of the role of evidence in health policy have evolved over time. We need to better understand the policy environment so we can more accurately diagnose its problems and more strategically apply the solutions. And we desperately need to implement new ways of injecting evidence into health policy. And I'll close with a very fitting quote from Justice Hall that I hope that we'll take with us in our heart when we leave Montreal. Medicare has been called a sacred trust, and we must not allow that trust to be betrayed. So in closing, I'd like to thank again Greg, the Justice Hall Foundation, and CAHSPR for inviting me to speak with you today.